like a no-brainer that I would talk about how I ended up as a pig farmer after saying I would never be a pig farmer, or how I ended up opening a food truck and going back into the food service industry after I said I would never go back into the food service industry. But when I saw that it was a sense of spring, there was one story that I knew I had to tell. And I have to confess that I brought notes. And the reason for that is because it's not a story that I like to remember often or well. I actually wrote it 3 years ago, and it wasn't until 2 days ago that I read it again for the first time after writing it. And I put some thoughts in there just to kind of catch the story up to where I am now. But I definitely don't have it memorized, so I apologize for that. I used to think that there was a lesson in everything. Or maybe I thought that there needed to be a lesson in everything in order for things to make sense. In order to feel like I was moving in the right direction, even when I wasn't. Maybe it was a comfort thing, like a security blanket keeping me warm as I traveled through the cold unknown. Or maybe it was my way of justifying my journey and all of the missteps that I've made along the way. Whatever the reason, it became sort of a mantra for me. A failure like the bitter cold of winter, followed by the warmth of spring. A chance for new beginnings with whatever relevant lesson I had gleaned. I don't feel that way anymore. I've changed the way I look at things, at events in my life. If I find meaning, if I learn something, great. But I don't go looking for it anymore. I don't agonize over it anymore. I'm not sure what happened to cause that change in myself. I don't think that I've ever asked that question before. And maybe it's the story that I'm about to share with you. Saturday morning, 9:44 a.m. My husband Ryan walked through the back door and set a bucket of milk on the counter and says, "The cows ate an entire bag of chicken feed." To which I replied, "Oh, shit." "There goes $20 down the drain," he said. "Yeah," I replied. "That, and we'll be lucky if it doesn't kill them." And in the short time that it took for us to speak those few words, I was dressed and making my way out to the barn. I eked out some quick math in my head. 50 pounds of layer pellets, 2 cows. My lead cow probably ate more than the heifer, so it could be worse. As I made my way out to the paddock, I saw my heifer, Honey, munching on hay, looking no worse for the wear. And it wasn't until I saw my lead cow, Deluxe, that I knew that it couldn't be any worse. It was so painfully obvious. And again, I started doing math in my head. 50 pounds of layer pellets, 1 cow, my favorite cow, my Deluxe. Oh shit, indeed. I knew I needed to call our vet, Leslie. She arrived shortly thereafter and tubed Deluxe, gave her some water, some antacids, some activated charcoal to try and help her system prepare to deal with the overload that was coming. And then we were told just to watch and wait. When I was a little girl, I wanted to be a vet. I wanted to save all of the animals. I wanted to take in all of the animals. From the dead chipmunk that I found when I was 4 to the litter of 1-week-old kittens that I fostered when I was 14, I loved all of the animals. When I grew up and decided not to pursue becoming a vet, although I knew animals would always be a part of my life, I didn't actually think that they would be involved in my profession. Not that I knew what profession I wanted to enter at the time, I just figured it was highly unlikely. Life is funny like that. It can end up so different than how you pictured it, and yet still be so similar. About 24 hours later, Deluxe was eating small amounts of hay, looking slightly more expressive with her ears. It was obvious that she was uncomfortable, but she was up and moving with positive gut sounds and stable vitals. I took her out for a walk to see if I could interest her in some browse. I gave her a fresh bucket of water. I even threw her right into our hay stores, hoping that she would find something to munch on that would introduce some much needed fiber into her system. She ate some, but not much. We hoped we would see her slowly eat more and slowly get better. We had talked about where we would want for her to go down if it came to that. But after speaking with the vet throughout the day, we really didn't think it was going to come to that. We thought that she was going to continue to improve and recover. By Monday morning, she appeared the same as she had for most of the weekend. Not interested in food, uncomfortable. I had a scheduled afternoon chat with the vet, and so I kept my eye on her until around lunchtime. Then I made lunch for the kids, went out to the barn so that I could get her vitals before calling the vet to let her know how things were going. When I walked out to the paddock, Deluxe was down and bloated like a large balloon. I confirmed with my stethoscope the pinging sound that is so often associated with acidosis and bloat. I tried to get her standing in between talking with the vet. We discussed things I already knew, things I had read in books, things that I had never tried to perform on a cow before. We ended the call with the general agreement that I didn't have the tools necessary to tube the cow, and that the vet was unable to make it out for quite some time. I didn't have the tools necessary. Unless maybe I was willing to think outside of the box. When I moved out to Colorado 15 years ago, I had no plans other than traveling west of the Mississippi for the first time in my life. I started working in food service, fell in love, started a family, and eventually began growing a farm. I never questioned the path that I was on. Of course, I questioned my abilities. Am I capable enough? Am I knowledgeable enough? Am I strong enough? Farming is not, I've learned, for the weak of heart. And questions like these beg to be answered. I knew I had a garden hose I could cut a section out of. The only thing I was missing was a hard tube to pass the hose through. If I didn't have that, then she could just bite down on the hose and shut off the open release valve for the gas that was building up in her rumen. I sat in the house and the wind blew and the wind chimes rang. And I looked outside the window and I saw the wind chimes long metal tubes, just slightly larger in diameter than my garden hose. It was exactly what I needed. I cut a single chime out of the present that my mother had given my husband when we first moved to the property. And I cut the garden hose to the proper length. I gathered a bucket of water, mineral oil, baking soda, fiber, a long blade knife, and my 9mm just in case. I told the kids to get ready to go play outside because Mommy needed to go help Deluxe. I made my way to the paddock and tied Deluxe so that she was standing uphill. I put the metal tube into her mouth and started sliding the hose through the tube. I couldn't tell if she was swallowing as I pushed it down, but I pushed until I felt a slight resistance. And I stopped and listened, but I didn't hear any gas coming out. But I couldn't tell if I was in her stomach. Had I pushed it through enough? My nerves got the best of me and I pulled everything out. Right at that moment, Brian came home from work. Seamlessly picked up Deluxe's head as I put the tube back in her mouth and started threading the hose down her throat. When it hit her stomach, an eruption of gas came out of the hose and turned into a steady stream. I smelled it, just to be sure, and it burned my nose hairs, and I jumped, and I gagged, and I cussed, and I felt so relieved because it was working. I massaged her sides and they came down. I funneled in some water, mineral oil, fiber, and then pulled the hose out. And we pushed and pulled and got her up into the barn on level ground. Those questions remain unanswered in my head to this day. Am I capable enough? Am I knowledgeable enough? Am I strong enough? But the only person who can answer those questions is me. I can't listen to the women who mock me for spending so much time growing my own food when I could simply go and buy it in the store. I can't listen to the government employee who described my business model as cute, but said that it would basically amount to nothing, which is why he was unable to recommend me for the grant I was inquiring about. I can't listen to the conditioning of my society, which says loud and clear that farming is a man's work, something that women are ill-suited to perform. A society that asks, do we give a man a fish or do we teach him how to fish, without much consideration for its women? What do we give them? By that time, the vet was heading in our direction. She advised us to see if we could find anyone who had recently butchered a cow or a deer or any grazing animal, so that we could take the liquid out of their rumen and transplant it into Deluxe. I've seen it work miracles before, she said. And it should have hit me then that we were looking for a miracle. But I was focused on the task at hand. I was focused on the bloating. When the vet pulled up, we found Deluxe fully bloated again. She tubed her and let out some of the gas before pouring in some surfactant to try and decrease the bloating. But it wasn't working. She stabbed her in her paralumbar fossa on her side, and even though we could hear the gas rushing out of the hole in her, she was still growing larger. And we all knew what was happening. She was dying. So I pulled my 9mm from my side, leaned my head out of the barn door and asked the kids to go and play on the porch by the house. I put one in the chamber, and I turned to face Deluxe, because she was gone. My favorite cow, my milk cow, gone. We ended the day with my husband in the barn carving steaks, which we would feed to our dogs, which tirelessly guard our livestock. The children played on the dirt pile next to the barn, wondering when dinner would be ready. And I sat on the porch, drinking a very nice single malt scotch, with tears streaming down my face. And I finally got up to go into the kitchen to make dinner for the kids. I wiped the tears from my cheeks, and I looked up to see what time it was. And I noticed for the first time that the clock was stuck, as it had been for days, at 9:44 a.m. I may never get an answer to my questions. I may never learn the ultimate lessons of this life. But what I do know after all of this is that I am here. Maybe there were endings or no endings. Maybe there were new beginnings, or maybe I just got out of bed, made the coffee, and carried on anyways. Maybe there was a lesson. Maybe there was no lesson. But here I am. I'm here. And that is all that matters. I would like to end my story with a poem that I wrote about this event, and it seemed fitting given what we woke up to this morning. Winter wounded me. A gaping, bloody hole is all I have left. How did she know my weakness? Did she smell it on my breath? I sit and wait for time, for the wind to bring her back. I sit and I wait. But all I get is spring. She whispers in my sleep. She drops a soft, new blanket of snow at my feet. Wake up, she says. Look around and see. Your entire world is glistening white, old failures and new beginnings alike. And I tell myself to open my eyes. And I open them. And I weep at the beauty and the truth of it all. Thank you.